So we got quite a bit of community feedback for phase one. And then we put phase two out a couple of months ago, and we have been busy putting all of that material together and getting it ready to present to you. It's been out there now for a while, and the feedback that we have received has been largely positive. There's kind of a acknowledgement of the work that's gone into this, the scope of the work, the depth of the work, the quality of the benchmarking and the other communities that we've looked at. But now we're ready for some more feedback from the community. So that was pretty much the reason why this meeting was called today. We're very anxious to hear your thoughts on all parts of phase two, but especially on some of the more controversial pieces of it. For instance, where do we go from here? How do we get from this point to implementation of these, some of the recommendations that we've made? What do you think of the committee that the process that we've put together that would look at the whole ARB approval process? So we're really looking for feedback today. Guys?
Thank you, Matt. I might just add that the phase two report, which we issued last month, was really broken down into three component parts. First was looking at benchmarking comparable how architectural review control is handled in comparable communities. And the second part was before we talk about what the ultimate structure of architectural review might look like on Kiawah Island and how best to get there, what are some of the things that each of our institutions should be considering or doing or trying to work with the ARB to accomplish before there is a long-term structural change? I don't know if we necessarily need to take each one of those in order to address comments. I'm not sure we need to be that rigid and welcome thoughts of others, but ultimately this is your meeting. This is an opportunity for community feedback on both the benchmarking that the task force has done, on the near-term recommendations. There were 6 categories of near-term recommendations, and then on some of the phase-in and long-term structural changes for how best to deal with architectural control and long-term on Kiawah Island.
One of the things that I like best about how we structured this was we recognized the issues that the community had brought forward. We tried to address them. We went to the ARB and got their input, and we had a pretty collaborative process throughout. There's a lot of meat in this report, so we would, yes, see a lot of that. So have at it, please tell us what you're thinking. Dave, you want to add anything?
Yeah, one of the things that was fairly consistent that there's general agreement that we need an architectural control or review board. It's done very well for the island as far as the way it's been built, but there are some things that are unpopular, so to speak, but the overall aesthetic of the island has been really enhanced by the architectural review board. That's fairly constant. People weren't really complaining about that. It's just other things like fines and, you know, painting your house the same color type issues. But as far as maintaining the quality of the architecture on the island, most people were satisfied with that.
And I think that's something that we also saw too in the benchmarking, is that Kiawah has professionals, licensed professionals on their boards, and not every community does that. So I think that would be something in our proposal, that we want to maintain that high level of professionalism that we do have now.
Michael, Kevin?
I just would really like to open the floor for us to listen. So whoever wants to come forward with questions, comments, I think now is the time.
Do we have folks signed in online?
We do. We have 9 folks, 2 are staff, but we don't have any raised hands just yet.
You can start with people in the room. Alex?
I'll get started. Alex Fernandez, 418 Snowy Brook. I want want to make some, first, I want to congratulate the group. I think it's an excellent piece of work. You know, I'm sure, you know, I know it took a long time or a while to get this done, but congratulations, thank you very much. Okay. I want to make comments not only as a ARB user, but as a KICA board member, obviously getting feedback from homeowners. I went through the documents and I have some questions and some comments, recommendations to you. On page 14, some of the recommendations from the work group with reference to the fees and deposits. I don't know why you came to the conclusion that only deposits in excess of $1,000 should go into an escrow account. I believe all deposits should go into an escrow account. I don't know why determined that. I don't know if over 1,000 is more important than less than 1,000. I think there's probably more frequency under 1,000 than there is over 1,000. So I would ask you to reconsider that. The second is reference to deposits should be returned within 5 business days upon homeowner's request. Now, this is from a personal viewpoint of personal experience. I did not call after I was approved or my project was approved. I had $2,500 deposit, and I waited 365 days to call. Then my deposit was returned. I believe that the process should not just require for the homeowner or the ARB user to call to ask for his deposit. I think the system should generate automatically the return when the approval is given for his project. I'm sure that systems-wise, you can easily do that instead of somebody forgetting to call or some people that just don't call or whatever. But I don't think it's reasonable to ask people to call to give me my money back. I think it should automatically be generated from the system after the approval has been given to the project. The second is on page 15. You go through the process of the variances, and I'm totally in agreement with that. We need to increase the transparency and accountability when there's a variance given to a homeowner or my neighbor. But I think you have to go wider than just adjacent property owners. I would ask that you use the same process that the town of Kiawah uses for their zoning variances, which is further than just your neighbor on your left or on your right, not just adjacent property owners. It goes a little bit further than that. Your across the street neighbor, and then maybe, I don't recall exactly how, but I know it's much further than just 2 adjacent. I think you should extend that. You know, variances is a community issue. It's not just adjacent neighbors. So I think we should go further than that. And then then when it says the ARB should provide the basis for make public any decision grant variance, I think that should be communicated to those people that were affected as well too, positive or negative, whatever the variance result was, whatever the hearing result was. It just not just make it available. They should receive notification. I know that I've had a neighbor that 3-4 doors away that was granted a variance, and then the town of Kiawah notified me that the variance had been granted. If the variance had been denied, I should be communicated. So it just not make it available, but communicate to those same people that you notified about the variance should also be, okay. And then I don't understand about property owners. This comment is property owners shall have the right to appeal any staff decision to ARB in a proceeding which is open to the public unless the property owner requests a closed proceeding. I don't think, again, in the spirit of transparency and accountability, I don't think any variance process, appeal or the original request for variance should be closed. They should all be open. And if the homeowner requests a variance or requests an appeal, that appeal should also be open to the public on what, you know, why he was granted why the appeal was granted or not, and what the reasons were why he was requesting that appeal. So I believe that whole process should be very transparent and disclose to the neighborhood. And last is, this is a personal comment with reference to, there's been discussion, and I think it was announced that the transition to the homeowners or whoever, the KICA, whatever, it would have several stages, and several stages that could take 3-4 years. Now, I'm disappointed in that because I believe that that the present KICA board are not the only people that have knowledge in Kiawah. We have a lot of knowledge on this island, a lot of knowledge, and that can be easily tapped on. The knowledge is not just right only today at the KICA, at the ARB board. It extends further than that, and it extends to all of Kiawah. And I believe there's a lot of people out there that would use their knowledge today and have it available to us today. So I don't agree with the process that, we've got a great knowledge on the present board and, we should not lose it. Yes, I agree with that. And we do have great knowledge, but doesn't mean that that's the only place where great knowledge resides. We have great knowledge in all throughout the island. And then the other thing, let's not underestimate KICA management either. KICA management, I think, is capable of running, an operation like ARB. There's no reason to otherwise nothing. So we've heard on many occasions, comments about being very pleased about how KICA management runs our operation. So they should, we should not underestimate the management capabilities that we have in KICA. So again, I'm not on the tune that this needs 3-4 years for people to learn the process and whatever. I think we're a lot smarter than that. What I do believe that the reason on the 3-year or 4-year process is really to delay community input and what I believe is the largest next project that we will be seeing, and that's the beachfront parcels. By delaying it 3-4 years, that means that the present developer will be the sole entity that will give approval, will oversee the beachfront process, the beachfront project. And so delaying it 3-4 years also puts at risk that community input, being by an ARB that's totally managed by the community, will not have input into that beachwalker parcels project, which is a project that's enormous. It will have an enormous impact on our community, and I believe that this will be, by the ARB being in the hands of the community, we will be able to have more control and overseeing over what happens in that beachwalk process. So with that, I thank you. Thank you.
Alex, if I may ask a question.
Yes, sir.
I just want to clarify, that the work group has not recommended, such over process. I know that there's a lot of discussion, but this is not currently, what phase 2 has transpired, so to speak, in our proposal. Just wanted to clarify that. Is that also your understanding?
I agree, Michael. I didn't say that. I said there's been comments out there that this process will be through a 3-4 stage process, and I believe that just the delay process so that we have little or no input into the beachwalk process.
Yeah, I agree with you, Alex. Thank you. Thanks for clarification.
Point that Michael made, as you probably know, the town is already undertaking the process of reviewing and with regard to implementing a tree and landscape ordinance that would provide an overlay for this. So this begins to address part of these issues as well. So things are happening.
No, I think there's a lot of activity going on, but this is a concern of mine that that project's going to take years to develop to its final stages. It's not going to be, and for us to be, the community be kept out of overseeing the development of that project, I don't think it's something that we ought to pursue or go for it. That's my, okay. Thank you.
So we have, online, we have Phil Nicolucci-Ongaro. Phil, you should be, unmuted.
Yes, can you all hear me now?
We can, Bill.
Okay, yes, and don't look for my face up there, I have my camera off. I just have a couple general observations and questions. I've read this and I congratulate all the work that's been done. It is a phenomenal amount to get where we are today. What concerns me is when I read the column work group recommendations, and then I go over to the feedback from ARB management, there's a fairly strong disconnect on many things. And it seems to me that there are some things that KICA ought to start taking up immediately. And I mentioned this at a board meeting, and it was suggested that this will all be taken care of. But for example, there's been ongoing discussions over KICA having to seek approval for road signs or for stripes in the roads or for projects along those lines. And that's really not what the ARB rules require, and it's acknowledged, and KICA just does it as a matter of course. And I think there's things that KICA could do right now to streamline the process for the projects they have, which would also set the stage for what the ARB will look like down the road. Because I think there's a lot of things that get reviewed by the ARB that aren't necessarily required by the ARB rules. And it's just been, we've always done that. I also agree with Alex's comment that's concerned that many of these projects will continue to fall under the ARB review. And I have to take issue with the comment, as many folks probably do, that the ARB treats the commercial developer the same as it does the private developers. It doesn't really work that way. What you and I and others have to go through to get projects approved seems to be a whole lot different. When I look at what happened at the Cape and the clear cutting and the lack of mitigation and all the other things that went wrong up there, if I had done that on my property, I can't imagine the amount of fines I would have been hit with. So I just think we ought to be looking closely at things that you all as a group realize and agree that you don't think the ARB has that authority, and start implementing the changes now, because that's the way the direction would go if KICA took over the ARB. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Paul?
My name is Paul Hennessy. I live at 12 Blue Herring Pond Road. I thought the work was very good and would applaud the members of the task force who did it. The one item that I didn't see in the comparable function analysis was any discussion of economics. I don't know, and I don't know if you know, and I don't know if we can know, but I think we need to know whether this is a costly exercise, whether it's a profitable exercise, whether it's a break-even exercise. And maybe it will be difficult to know given the current structure of the ARB and then the fact that the ARB serves different constituencies besides homeowners. But I do think that the committee needs to be mindful of economics in the context of whatever recommendations that it makes. I would also like to go to the near-term recommendations on page 15 and 16, because I think they're sensible ones. And I would encourage that some of these changes be operationalized near term. In particular, and I think Alex touched on this, but I think making the deliberations public. What's on the agenda? What exceptions are being requested? What was the adjudication? What was the rationale? I guess there could be an issue of privacy, but if I'm as a homeowner asking for an exception to designing with nature, I shouldn't be embarrassed to have that be a public, available for public inspection. So I think the number of things here on page 15 and 16 can be operationalized near term. More broadly, I would encourage us to think about what we can do near term on a consensual basis. There are some things that I can see would be debatable and maybe take longer because of the structural implications, et cetera, and that's fine. Ultimately, if we need to have a covenant amendment, that's fine. But I'd like to see what we could actually accomplish near term consensually, because it strikes me that there are a number of things that make very good sense and can be done near term.
Paul, can I ask you to elaborate on that when you say consensually, between which parties?
Between KICA, the town, and the developer. I think those are the main actors. So those are my points. I think the disclosure and transparency issues are very sensible, and I think they can be done and should be done near term. I see no reason why we shouldn't do that. If there are reasons that I haven't thought of, I'd like to hear it. But more broadly, let's see what we can do near term, and if there are issues where there are, strongly held views on both sides, let's narrow that down and decide separately what we need to do to resolve those. But I think a lot of the changes that have been recommended in here make sense. And if possible, we should try to figure out, is this a moneymaker, money loser, is it break even? Because ultimately that set of facts is going to be important to us.
Paul, if I could just ask one question, because you referenced near-term recommendations on both page 15 and 16 and operationalizing things in the near term. There's somewhat of a distinction between the recommendations on those two pages. You specifically referenced transparency in meetings. That would require the ARB essentially to operationalize that. Other recommendations are ones that KICA and TOKI could unilaterally undertake.
Yeah.
So would you view?
That distinction is not important to me, but let's figure out what collectively the major parties can do now and show the community, broadly defined, that we can move to the final solution, which will require a different governance oversight for sure. That's more complex, more negotiation, so on and so forth. But let's focus on what we can do like now.
Paul, this is Michael, if I may. So first of all, as usual, you bring up a very important point about the economics of all of this. Unfortunately, we have not been granted as a work group access to any financial data, ratios, costs versus revenue streams, et cetera, of the current ARB. But I hope that the partners will, fulfill, promise is a big word, but something in that neighborhood, when we are stepping into phase 3, to provide us with that financial equation, because I fully agree with you. The last decision about how a future ARB should be set up can only be based on a proper business plan, right? We need to know what are revenue streams for what, how are they, accounted for, what are the costs that are implied with any different type of approvals, so that we understand, then also with the required, personnel, et cetera, for a future ARB, what that all would mean, and if this can be run at least at a break even, or if the community has to subsidize to some degree the work. So I think that's a very, very important topic. As it relates to transparency and disclosure, I think I can only say what Brad also said. That's, something we clearly stated needs to be fulfilled by the current ARB, as we all know, and there's a great deal of hesitation. Honestly, the only explanation I received why there is not more transparency is because that there are homeowners that don't want that. I can really not understand that. But that's the current argument why there cannot be more transparency and disclosure. Just
Okay. So, Michael, I would just respond that this issue of economics is not unique to our community. There are other communities that bear the cost in different structures, understandably, but bear the cost of an ARB type function. So I guess I was just a little surprised that in doing the benchmarking, which was very helpful, this didn't appear to be a dimension that was looked at. And yes, I agree. The most obvious source of this information is the ARB as it exists today, albeit that is more complicated than might be intuitive. But yes, we need to give some serious thought to the economics of the situation. In terms of transparency, again, at the expense of repeating myself, if somebody is asking for a waiver, I kind of agree with Alex. Why not make it public? So, okay.
Again, I have no good argument against that, but
Paul,
that's
on that latter
to the
part,
ARB.
if you were seeking a variance from the town, and in some cases the ARB says, in fact, you have to seek a variance from the town, that is a public matter.
Yeah.
That is a matter of public record. Picking up on the question and conversation Michael had, and get your thoughts about, the economics issue ultimately depends on which kind of model we choose. As Beverly noted, most other communities do not have professional staffs. It's comprised of architectural review boards, comprised of community volunteers, and maybe augmented by the existing homeowners association staff. So there's less of a cost implication there. Obviously, if we move to a professional staff model, that has a very different set of issues that I've brought to the board. Do you have a particular view about which might be the most appropriate for KICA?
I don't. I'm not an expert. I do know that with 4,500 front doors plus commercial, it's a big deal. So I'm not in any way trivializing the functional requirements of an ARB to serve our community. So I don't have a particular perspective on that.
And I think, if I remember right, I think the ARB has 4.5 full-time employees.
Currently, but we also have shared that financial data previously.
Right,
Just want to clarify that.
And it's, from even before this task force was put together, the board, the KICA board looked into costs, et cetera, before we formalize this. It's reasonable, but it'll probably be self-sustainable, because one of the things about this current ARB, they also do KICA. They're working on Orange Hill, that staff. So, from a macro standpoint, I think financially it's very doable with the professional staff, maybe even less as professional staff and some volunteers. Obviously, that structure, we couldn't really pinpoint here because we're looking for community feedback and how to structure it. But I don't think the cost is going to be something that we really have to worry about.
And one other aspect, just as far as the benchmarking is concerned, we initiated it by going out to various communities and asking for information, and we received information on a piecemeal basis, and then we used public sources. So that's why you don't see financials.
Okay. I guess just the last point I would make, and thank you for taking comments. I would second David's point that, net, the aesthetics of the island are exceptional, and obviously the ARB is a big part of that. So we need to be respectful of the impact of aesthetics on the underlying value of property on the island.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I follow up on what Amanda just said? So you're saying the ARB has shared financial information with the work group, because I have never seen that.
Kevin, I know you had seen it.
Okay, have you shared this with the work group or with the KICA board? Because those are two different things.
I've shared it with the KICA board, and also I shared it with you, Kevin. I don't know if you passed that along or not.
Well, Kevin is a board member, so has any of the other work group members seen, not
Yeah,
KICA
let me
members
jump-
seen that?
Let me jump in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
And I apologize, I'm driving to deal with a family emergency, but we did get a memo that we restricted to the KICA board last year. So no, we didn't share that information with the rest of the work group, but it was quite light. It had some information about their expenses. I think the most appropriate thing would be to get more detail on the revenue streams. How much is for major items? How much is for minimal items? I think we could back into what kind of staff we think we need, but having, knowing what the offsetting revenues are would be very helpful.
Is there a reason why the KICA board has not shared that with the work group?
I think it was originally prepared for, like, it was Amanda, remind me, I think it was a memo that you and Shannon wrote a couple years back talking about transition. If no one objects, I can get it around, but I don't want to overstate it. It was very light information.
But it did include revenue as well, I believe.
If I recall, it was pretty much a wash.
Yeah,
It was like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
right, but
It was a while ago.
right, I reshared it more recently.
Financial impact should not impede us going forward with this. I mean, this is not a financial impact issue, from what I remember.
But
We have KICA board
number
members
was-
here. Can we share, can
What?
the number was share that information?
I would say the number wasn't shocking. It was reasonable, and it was close to a wash. So at that point in time, the board kind of said, all right, Alex, I think you agree. Well, that's not an issue. The money's not an issue. We know that, based upon some very, very quick estimates, that cost is not gonna be a big deal. It's not gonna be a determining factor at all.
Yeah, I think
I-
one reason we didn't share it was, I think it was a collection of salaries as well. So they were only so useful because they work across multiple projects, but we also didn't want to let go of people's very rough comp information.
But I would, I would
We're operating.
Amanda is to give us that information.
okay, but okay. Again, I find it disturbing that this information wasn't shared with the work group, but that's probably a different conversation. But I would strictly oppose what somebody just said, I couldn't hear who it was, that money is not an issue, right? We should not, make any proposal to this community about a phase through and an implementation process without knowing the financial implications. Because there will be. To one way or the other, there will be implications either for the entire community or at least for those that are applying for a permit from the future ARB. So no decision should be made without a detailed business plan being developed in phase 3 of this project.
So Amanda, we can.
Yeah, I'll send it
we
around.
can distribute that to us. Sure, thank you. Next.
Other comments?
You don't have anything online?
I think Philip raised his hand at some point.
Yeah,
He has spoken.
lowered it. Oh, no, there he is. He's back.
No, he raised his hand after he spoke the first time.
No, I did raise my hand again, and as I was listening to the conversations, my concern was partially answered, and I'll just go ahead and reiterate it, and that is, one thing for me as a homeowner, the benefit of seeing what kinds of variances that have been given before to other property owners, regardless of whether they're my neighbors or somewhere else on the island, is to get a sense for what is allowable, what the process will allow, and what I can think about doing in my own property. It helps educate me as a property owner if I can see what's being done elsewhere on the island. I think that allows for much broader transparency. And I will just add, Michael, I agree with you on the financial side. It was an interesting conversation, and I urge you all to dig more deeply into what information the board does have and what information the board can share with you, and then what other information you would need from the ARB in order to develop a business plan, because that is critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
So one of the things that we struggled with, probably one of the most time-consuming pieces of this project, was the structure that we came up with that would look at architectural review, architectural control. And after all the benchmarking we did, we really didn't find a model that suited Kiawah particularly well. So we constructed this three-tiered approach. And it starts out with, we're a quasi-independent entity, largely housed under KICA, with 3 different tiers. So we've got the Architectural Governance Committee, which kind of controls the Architectural Control Board, which controls the permanent staff, which resembles what is at the ARB today. Did anybody take a look at that and dissect it and think that there were pieces of it that were good or that should be modified? Any recommendations come forward from any of you folks?
Other than me?
Please. No, seriously, feel free.
Well, I think it adds a layer of complication. I understand the desire to have multiple entities on the island basically contribute to who serves on the ARB, but I don't think you need to have those entities create a entity that then does that. I think it just complicates things. I think you could have multiple entities appointing people to serve on the board itself. I think you could create a separate group that maybe is even an appeal function, if that is the really issue that people want resolved. But I don't think you need to have 3 layers. I think 2 layers with the ability to entities to appoint to the initial layers is sufficient.
Well, let me respond to this, Amanda, because we had a lot of discussion about this, and Kevin and I were particularly those that were arguing for this 3-tier level. I think if we would be like 10 years back in time, when usually an ARB should have been handed over to the community, I would probably agree with your argument. But with what we have seen the ARB doing in recent years, I would feel a lot more comfortable to have this 3-tier level of more explicit community involvement to make sure we have the transparency that this community deserves, and we have the oversight that is practically, like in every, proper setup of governance, of having a control over what the Architectural Control Board, the ACB, or similar to what today is the ARB. I think that's very essential. We have gone too far down the road to build confidence in just, moving forward with our today's structure, just with a slightly different ownership.
I think today's structure is an ARB that is the developer. It's 1.5 steps, it's not even 2, because the developer controls the ARB. Now, I don't know how much they interfere with their day-to-day stuff, but one of the big issues on the island is developing its way with a lot more than everybody else. Whether it's true or not, I'm not going to opine on that. That's a perception. So I think we need something, just one more step, so that we get rid of that concern, that perception. And just as, let's say, the KICA board now has oversight overstaffed. It's not direct oversight over every committee, but the entire board is responsible for everything. And I think when we were talking, we wanted to make sure there was some independence here. We didn't want a direct correlation from the KICA board to the ARB. That might be just as bad. So we want something else over here overseeing that. The ultimate, if it comes to KICA, the ultimate bottom line authority has to be with the KICA board because we have the ultimate authority for KICA. But something in between that's a little more independent is kind of like we looked at it, just so this.
So David, if you had better disclosure in terms of what goes through for approvals, what the exceptions are, if there is a granting of exceptions, the rationale for granting, wouldn't that go a long way towards obviating the concerns appropriately expressed by the community?
I think
That's one of the reasons we have you all here, obviously. This is kind of what we looked at. We all agree. The chances of this being exactly this at the end game is slim enough, okay? It'll be something different than this. And, you know, is it one layer too many? Maybe. Maybe this is the way. I mean, this is why we want the input, is to see which way the community thinks we should go.
And I think that raises a very interesting point, a little bit more philosophically or conceptually. While people generally say ARB should at this point in our community's history reside within the HOA, as it does in most other communities, kind of the reason we're here is most of the concerns that have been expressed have not been with kind of the overall professionalism of the ARB. It's with regard to the things that have been identified and listed in the series of recommendations. And if in fact you didn't have all of those things, if you had more transparency, if there were perhaps editorializing on my part, not quite as much overreach with things like ordinary repairs and maintenance, there probably would be less overall concern. But we are where we are now. So I think we've started down the path that we need to continue to move forward on. And the issue, and Kevin had talked about this and has talked about this before, is, you know, what do we need to do collectively in order to achieve an end game, agreeing what that end game is, and what is the path to get that, and then what are the things that we can also do, ideally consensually, Paul, but some things are unilaterally could be undertaken by KICA and TOKI. Perhaps they just should be operationalized now. We're trying to get feedback on that. There are other things that if ARB chose to operationalize, they could do so tomorrow. That's up to them.
And let me add to this, Paul. I mean, yes, transparency will mitigate a lot of the issues that a lot of community members perceive, rightfully so, I believe. But just one practical example, right? You're a homeowner, you take your ideas and plans to the ARB and you're denied, okay? So you appeal. Today, you kind of end up with the same body. If we would not have that governance committee, you would either end up again with the Architectural Control Board, which I think is weird because they made the decision, you appeal, why would they change their opinion? Or it ends up with the KICA board, which we also wanted to avoid, both because of, you know, a workload for the KICA board, but also to, you know, keep the KICA board, you know, more out of this day-to-day business. So we need another level where a homeowner has a chance to take his appeal, his or her appeal, for something that was not decided, I guess, in his or her favor. And that cannot be the same body that actually denied such. So even just for that, I believe we need something like that third level to handle appeals, but also to really, you know, gain more trust by the community in this entire process.
Let me add one other practical matter. Just say, for example, the head of we want our ARB to be made up of professional people as much as possible. let's say one of them retires. We need someone to replace them. And you want it to be a citizen group. The head of the ARB retires. You want the citizen group to pick the next head of the ARB. We decided we'd like to keep it out of the political realm. So rather than go straight to KICA, we've again put this, as David described, the independent body in place. So we have a lot of residents involved in the process, not day to day, not meeting all day, twice a month, but in the governance. But we then also tried to keep it out of the direct elected officials at KICA and try to spread it as broadly as possible across the island.
I mean, if we get a good, valid appeal process, we don't know how many we're gonna get. We're gonna get 1 a week, 2 a week, how many decisions are being made by staff. We can't have the KICA board calling special meetings all the time. We need a group, in this case, that ARC, to be able to say, all right, we gotta meet, we got 3 or 4 appeals, because people want those appeals very quickly. If somebody has a decision on the first of the month, all right, file your appeal. Well, we're not gonna hear them until the next board meeting, which is 5 weeks away maybe. So, I think having that other, it's not gonna be professional staff on that, it's gonna be probably community leaders and hopefully some expertise in that, architects, engineers, et cetera. And, they're not gonna be meeting every week, maybe once a month at that. Maybe more often, depending on how many appeals we get. Hopefully, very few, if we have a good, staff.
David, once you go through this appeal process and set these 3 structures up, where's the linkage to the KICA staff itself? And where does the direction and authority go to them for things they have to do? It seems like I can't quite see that in this presentation.
Well, we're hoping that this is gonna be a self-standing group. Because one of the things we have to look at is, once KICA takes it over, we have to look at our ability to enforce, our ability to fine, et cetera, okay? That's gonna be proven to find. That whole December 18th thing, 2018 thing that never got recorded, that addressed that. So if we get it, we're gonna have to figure out how we're gonna enforce. And I think if KICA is gonna be an enforcement on it, the staff of the ARB should be, not overseen directly by our staff. I think it should be, that's my opinion, I think it should be independent of our current staff.
Now, putting aside the the 2018 issues with regard to the covenant, failure to record that. Otherwise, the KICA rules and regulations now that provide for the ability for KICA to fine members for a variety of things. And there's actually an appeal process to the KICA board that's embedded right now in the KICA rules and regulations. And whether that's actually been exercised by anybody else, hear appeals from the fine to the board. You may never have, in part because questions whether you can actually impose fine, but that is really written in already to the KICA rules and regulations. Whether KICA wants to carve out a different process for fines and issues related to architectural review as opposed to, because right now the KICA rules and regulations say you're required to maintain your property. Got to fix wood rot, this, that, and the other thing. That's all in the KICA rules and regulations. Whether KICA is enforcing those or essentially relying on the ARB to do so is a separate matter.
I think right now, most of that gets handled by Ed Money very well, so, there's some minor things that Ed addresses without having to get into too much tough enforcement. I've been on the board for 5 years and I haven't heard an appeal yet, so.
But it is a good question that we need to look more into, which is the interplay with KICA staff and how that would happen, especially depending on what we do with this vision that we set forth on page 20. We're just trying to give you the broad parameters of it, and that's an excellent
I just
point.
think you have to think that through.
We do, you're right.
And I think one more thing.
And that was planned actually for phase 3.
We can look at, the benchmarking. There were 10 properties listed here. 8 of them are controlled by owners. 2 are controlled by the developer. And in both instances, it's South Street Partners. They have those 2. So I think going down the road, we can find out a lot more about how these other HOA-controlled ARBs operate. And we might see a model that we like, we might see something that we don't want to hear about, but, so we haven't really gotten into the actual models of how they operate, but we do know that those are controlled by the HOA, and they're pretty successful projects.
Carolyn, North Parkside. I guess when listening to this, has your group had a chance to get more of the nitty gritty from the ARB as far as, you know, we have this inequity perception. Have you gotten the amount of cases that are KICA related or developer related or resort related versus homeowner related? And how many have been appealed, and how many different issues there are? I mean, it seems like when you're proposing the next step, you might need a little bit more of that information from the ARB as far as their day-to-day operations. Have you gotten that kind of information from them?
Probably not the level of detail that you're talking about, no.
Okay, and is that a possibility to get more information so that the community can make a good decision as far as, you know, deciding how, like you said, how many appeals there are or whatever, that if you have that background straight from the ARB and not just your benchmarking, that might help to create a better solution.
Yes, Carol, will be happy to share that.
Okay.
And I think too.
And
it's-
this was actually promised to us by the partners for phase 3
Yeah.
to receive that data. So
No more of that.
And so as we move through into phase 3 and we start looking more specifically at what this construct will look like, we obviously need that kind of data as well as the financial data to address both ways.
Right.
To come up with a complete picture of what we're gonna do.
Good.
Thank you,
Go for it.
good point.
And just something too to think about in terms of appeals, you're gonna have various levels of appeals. You'll have the staff decisions where that may be appealed then to the next level, which was to the board, and then we envision, you know, the final place would be the governance committee where you could appeal. So it's a little different. What we're proposing is a little different than the appeal process today that you may be thinking about.
Right.
Yell it online? I just have a question. I mean, I have to admit, I haven't looked through all this, but where does KICA come in terms of your issues like the partners or the developers having different, anyone looking over their environmental input, like things like clearing large spaces of trees, like they did for the parking lot over by the Timbers, or how close they move, how close they're building towards the beach. And I mean, shouldn't the architectural review board be equally judging their impact as well as they're judging the individual homeowners on trees on their property? It seems like they're being given a lot more leeway on what they do. And how is KICA getting any input into some of the egregious differences between what's allowed for them versus what's allowed for the rest of the community? And where are we gonna fit in? Or what happens? What's the plan for us changing that inequity? I mean, it's maybe in here already, and
Most of that is the town.
Yeah, David,
We don't, the KICA board, for instance, doesn't set side yard requirements or backyard requirements or buffer zones or zoning, all of that are town ordinances, okay? We have an interest in it, but some things we can enforce, other things the town enforces. And, you know, when you get involved in, what's the building height? that comes under all the zoning ordinances. We don't have a building height rule. So that's when we get into the maze of caves, who's in charge of what. And I get back to what I said earlier, the perception is that the developer gets away with a lot more than the average homeowner. And that's a perception.
So let me take another kind of angle at that. Dave's absolutely right that, you know, basic zoning standards are embedded in the town's zoning ordinances, land use regulations. And any property owner, including the developer, has to comply with those unless there was an agreement to comply with a different set of standards that were part of the development agreement, but they would still have to comply with those. There aren't any zoning standards, or there haven't been heretofore, with regard to, for example, maintaining trees, protecting trees, and natural environment or landscape. The town has now started down that path, and to the extent that that ordinance is enacted in the future, any property owner, including Kiawah Partners, the resort, or anybody else, would have to comply with the town's requirements. If there were still a separate ARB owned by the partners, it could enforce more restrictive standards on property owners, but it couldn't allow something that was prohibited by the town's tree ordinance, for example, or landscaping standards. But the other interesting thing about all of this is KICA, there is nothing that actually precludes KICA from establishing its own ARB right now and putting in place, assuming you get the 2018 amendment recorded, all the same rules and regulations, those in design of nature, and then you can impose that on any member, which would include the developer. The issue then is that doesn't remove the ability of the current ARB and the developer to continue to enforce their rights under the general covenants. So you would basically end up with duplicative standards. But you could, either the town or KICA could address that issue, but it introduces its own complications.
This is a hypothetical, don't panic, I mean, okay. Theoretically, KICA could form an ARB tomorrow. The town could pass an ordinance that says you get a building permit when you get approval from either the ARB, or the KICA ARB. Theoretically, they could do that. So a homeowner says, I think I'll go over here. Beautiful, stop building. If we did that, I think the partners would be running into court very quickly to say, they still have to get our approval. So it's the transition is, we can't do it unilaterally. We either have to get agreement with them, or the nuclear option is we have a general covenant change to just convey the ARB to KICA. I don't know if that would pass. It requires a lot of votes. We prefer to go the other way. We've been officially notified by the partners that they want to assist and go forward with the transition. What I've seen so far is unacceptable to me, but maybe we can do better.
You have a follow-up?
No, 3 to 4 years seems too long, considering how fast and how uninformed everybody is before things happen that are permanent and are affecting the whole community. You know, the parking lot issue, the tree issue, the boardwalk issue.
So going back to your next phase, to make sure you have that transparency part of it, that maybe it's a weekly update, that we're hearing all those things.
We have kind of like two separate things the community's looking at. Everybody's individual contact with the ARB is over here.
Yeah.
There's 2 major projects they're putting forward. Now, as you know, it's going to be the parcel across from the Cape, 13B, where they're proposing some parking and what's next to the gas station. I think between KICA and the town, I think our eyes are wide open and we're watching those fairly closely right now.
Right.
So I think to the extent that the town, and KICA have any power at all to put their feet to the fire and make sure they do it the right way, that's happening, okay? I think the chances of them doing something that is gonna result in, how did they get away with that? I don't think that's gonna happen with those two projects.
So,
That's
to-
my view.
and to follow up, look at page 26 of our presentation, which is the path to independent architectural control, which we considered if the developer assigns the rights to KICA. Otherwise, we have to leave property owner action, which will take time. The soonest we could vote would probably be next March. So that's already 1 year out in the future. And by the time you implement it, you're already 2 to 3 years. And then most likely you'd end up in some type of litigation. Litigation is costly and litigation is slow. So all of a sudden the 3 years isn't outrageous. And maybe we could bring that time frame down.
So if I could just make an observation to our neighbor on the front row. I think the issue that you're really raising, which I think people are focused on now, but haven't been in the past, is enforcement. So there are rights that prescribe what can be built, where, and how. They're not simple, they're complicated. I'm certainly not an expert, but I think there is a growing realization that the discipline and consistency of enforcement of whether was the development agreement or otherwise standards needs to be enhanced and focused and professionalized and done absolutely correctly. We can't, and certainly I'm not in a position to speculate about the past and the motivations and so on and so forth. But we have rules, we have standards, and they need to be enforced.
And then I'll add to that just a little bit. The fact that the community has become so involved in a lot of the details around these major projects, the fact that it's very hard to be blind to the impact of these major projects. That has all taken us back better than enforcement. So as somebody so eloquently said in a post recently on Kiawah, this stuff is complicated. And you deal with it every day and you realize just how complex it is. So Paul, yes, people are paying more attention to enforcement issues. However, the folks who are working on this at the town are also looking to make sure that some of these things just don't happen again. And so Brad referenced the tree preservation ordinance, that's going into effect, and it's frankly, the link to what happened down in West Beach is very tight. The rezoning that council recently passed is because we were looking hard at what are the right ways to zone some of these properties for redevelopment projects going forward. So there's planning going on as well as attention to enforcement. And a lot of that is the result of a very well-informed, engaged community.
That's essential, and it's hard to get the word out with, people like me who are part-timers. It's essential. But the parking lot issue, I mean, if they get away with that, that's a lot of toxins eventually flowing in, to the spit area and runoff from parking lot, and lack of absorption of stormwater runoff and more flooding. We're doing this floodwater abatement for what? If we're gonna put parking lots.
Where is your property? Your property?
We're in West Beach, but I'm just talking about if they put the parking lot down near the partners, the other end that they're planning up down near.
The Upper Beach walking parcels. Thank you.
Just stretching, or was there another question?
No, I did want to just quickly add a few comments. So my name is Mary Ellen Perugini, and I'm at 24 Reds Bluff Road, and it brings a little bit of PTSD to be in this room and hear all of this stuff, because
building on Kiawah is really, really challenging for a homeowner who's very engaged. And I know the committee has heard a lot of this input, including from me, and you're beyond that, but I really commend that you are working towards this goal. And I just want to emphasize that it cannot come soon enough. So a lot of what has been talked about to try to really move forward as quickly as possible is so important. And I wanted to just comment on a couple of things that come into my head as I hear, for instance, on transparency, that that will do a lot. And the sooner we can get things transparent and make the current processes that we may have to live with for 3 years or whatever the timeline is on certain things, the better, because my personal experience was to look at the Design with Nature book, study it, literally, I had it highlighted throughout, worked with an architect that was very aware of the rules, and we'd come up with a plan and there would be a no. And then we could scratch our heads and go around and say, well, what about this house just got built down the road and it was exactly the same, so why no? And the bottom line in terms of the true, just mind-boggling lack of transparency was that no matter how much data was presented, photographs of exactly what had just been built the year before, and why are you saying no to this for us? The bottom line answer was, your project is individual, and we don't have to tell you anything about why we decided what we did on another project. It was just individual. And we had built a home before, but nothing like building a home on Kiawah to burn us out. So the transparency part was bad. I commend Amanda in the sense that when this broken system of we don't have to answer to you, Mr. and Mrs. Homeowner, finally got to the point where we were just, we were beaten down, we were probably that short, but we were finally just begging for something. Amanda would have a meeting with us, and she's a great problem solver, and she would be able to come up with something for us. But believe me, by then we were so beaten down, there were so many things that we were not able to work with the ARB on, because that was the bottom line, is that it felt like I had left the United States of America, and that I was dealing with an organization that just said, it's our way or the highway. And so the transparency will go a long ways. And then the only other thing to echo off of what Carol Jeffries had to say is, if we could focus on some of the things that make absolutely no sense in the way that the ARB, there's a lot of things that do make sense, and I agree that aesthetically we have a beautiful island, but there are some things, and certainly the amount of impervious surfaces on this island is a direct result of the ARB rules, and it's all a matter of incentivizing people and telling them that, let's say, if they do a permeable driveway, well, that's much better for the environment, much better for the long-term water table and everything else, all the flooding that we've very recently experienced in spades. So right now, to this day, and I have stood up in front of these kinds of podiums many times since I built my house, and I've been in about 4.5 years now, and said this, and it doesn't go anywhere, which is, why do we completely treat, from an ARB and a lot coverage standpoint, a concrete driveway the same as we do a gravel driveway? If we care about the trees, and we care about our marshes, and we care about infiltration of water during all of these events, then we have been doing this wrong for so long. So I would just ask you to work on certain things sooner than later, and that would be one of them, the permeable versus impermeable surfaces. Another item, if you're going to be transitioning, slowly with certain things, would be the landscaping stuff. And it sounds like you're doing some of this stuff with tree protection. But when it comes to landscaping, one of the ARB people who was the worst offender of not being able to work with homeowners, and I think, has that reputation, just the amount of landscaping that made no sense. And I'm big into landscaping. People basically would put the wrong plants in because of the half-height foundation rule, and they might have been, a sweet viburnum that's going to get way too big in front of that window, and it didn't matter. It was just a very rule-oriented, crazy thing. And if you wanted to put in a more native plant that might be slower growing, and you literally couldn't find a big enough pot that would be the half-height, then okay, we want you to put another layer in, and suddenly have 8 plants there, when really it can only sustain 3 or 4 in the long term. So the number of people on this island who have suffered, financially, to rip out landscapes that made no sense because of that particular person at the ARB
is just phenomenal, and I know it ties into some of the tree issues as well. So perhaps you could just work on particular items and the focus on our long-term conservation of surface area, permeable as possible, and as many native plants as possible, which I think is still not a motivator within the ARB landscape plans. That would be a priority, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mary.
Anybody else have their hand raised?
Nope.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions? Mark, Amanda, comments?
Well, thank you all very much for coming. We sure do appreciate it. Some valuable input today. Will help us move forward.
Someone just raised their hand.
You're gonna insist that you're gonna get.
Tim Hill, Tim, you should be unmuted.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Technology is working great. First, I'd just like to commend the working group and all the volunteers. I think the phase 2 report was not only extremely well done, but the due diligence, the benchmarking, the hours, I'm sure, of hard work by that group is greatly appreciated. And I really like how it turned out in a big way and look forward to the next phase. I think one area that I have weighed in on in the cement comment forum as well as Kiawah, one party, you want to call them that's kind of missing providing input would be the contractors, the service providers that actually work on Sea Islands and specifically our island. I'd really be interested to see whether it's a survey or something like that from currently licensed and those who are not currently licensed to work on Kiawah to get their input on how the ARB operates, how it impacts them and their customers. So a new home, a remodel, maintenance is only as good as the provider who performs the service. And in my personal experience, as well as quite a few of my neighbors and friends on the island, when you have a maintenance or minor remodel, or even looking at a bigger remodel, and you reach out to contractors, many of them will say, we don't want to work on Kiawah. Too hard to work with your ARB and your permitting from your community association, et cetera. And I've heard this so many times from friends and neighbors and experienced it myself. It'd be interesting to do a survey to find out why people don't want to work on Kiawah. The more contractors we have, the more competition we have, the better pricing and choices we would get. So that to me would be very interesting. And the only other thing I'll say, I know people are trying to leave, is I would like to see an ARB that does have governance. I do like the proposed plan put in place. So you do at least have a chain for appeals and or overriding things that an ARB might decide that are kind of nebulous or kind of over the top, being picky, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's important. But also I'd love to see kind of in the mission in the next phase, not for the working group, but what an ARB ideally should be, is a service organization to homeowners, to the contractors who make their living coming here, and some level of an SLA or whatever we want to call it, service level agreement on timing when you submit a request to get a permit or have something approved. Because I've also heard from neighbors and experienced it myself, like, we have to get this done. Such and such is failing, and it's taking forever to get a permit or to get approval from the ARB, et cetera. So I think it might be nirvana to ask for an ARB to be a service org versus a watchdog, but it'd be nice to have that helping hand. Like, no, Mr. Hill, you can't do this. Let me tell you how you can get this done. So those are my comments. And again, I really appreciate the fine work that the working group and all the volunteers put in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
That's really it.
Sorry, just to,
Go ahead, Michael.
yeah, I just wanted to emphasize what Tim Hill was just saying. So my wife and I have just started a major remodel project in another community of the United States. And it's a substantial project. It took the design review board, as it is called in that community, 2 weeks to approve this process. Just as a comparison to what we are facing here. And it was, a lot of debate and a lot of discussions and a lot of good input, but 2 weeks later, we were done and could start construction. So that's the difference in service level that we have to debate and define for a new ARB going forward.
I think we're adjourned. Thank you all.
Everybody, pop it up quick.